In this video, we're going to take a break from writing code and we're going to talk about a slightly more soft question. When I say soft, I mean a question that doesn't really involve code, and it's a lot more about your ability to communicate with your interviewer. So let's take a look at what the question is. All right, how would you design Twitter? Sometimes you'll see alternates to this question, and it might be something like, how would you design Uber or design eBay or any of a number of different services? Because this question can be asked about many different services, I'm going to use this video to give you some general strategies on how to answer this question. So we're not going to focus exactly on giving you an exact word-for-word answer on how to design Twitter. We're going to instead focus on some of the details of the question and try to focus on exactly what your interviewer wants to hear from you. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some high-level notes around this question. So some things to keep in mind around this question. The first and most important thing to understand is that there is no right answer to these questions whatsoever. There's no right answer. Products like eBay and Uber and Twitter, they're all built by hundreds, if not thousands, of different engineers. And so it would be pretty naive to think that we could get a concrete definition of exactly how to build Twitter in the 10 to 20 minutes that you'll have to answer this question. So they're not looking for the exact blueprint on exactly how you would put Twitter together. Your interviewer is much more looking at exactly how you communicate what you're trying to say and exactly what areas you are focusing on when you're answering the question. So with that in mind, that leads us to the second point here, which is the second most important point, and that is that every single interviewer who ever asks you this question are always going to be expecting to hear different things. So interviewer A at one company is going to want to hear about how you would identify challenges in the product, and then maybe interviewer B would want to hear about how you would scale out the product for hundreds of thousands or millions of users. So every single interviewer wants to hear a slightly different answer. It's going to be up to you to figure out exactly what to focus on. Now, an easy way to figure out what area to focus on in a given product is to simply ask your interviewer. You can simply say to them, hey, this product Twitter has many different features involved in it. Is there some particular area that you want me to focus on? Now, very commonly, your interviewer will simply respond, no, just give it your best shot, tell me what comes to mind, but it's at least worth trying to ask that question and glean a little bit more information out of them. Now, with that in mind, if your interviewer does not give you any particular area to concentrate on at all, usually a good place to start concentrating on is the data model. And when I say data model, I'm talking about how you would build out a database to reflect all the information for the given product. So in the case of Twitter, you might focus on how you would store tweets in the database or how you would store users in the database. Again, this is a question that really depends upon some amount of experience. So if you do not have experience working with a database or architecting out records in a database, well, unfortunately, that's kind of what the question is trying to root out here. If you don't have experience with databases like that, then it's always possible for you to try to pivot the discussion over to areas that you are familiar with. So for example, you might try to talk a lot more about how the web user interface should be put together. Now, I really recommend that you not focus on just spouting off different frameworks or different technologies that you would use. So a very poor way to answer this question, I really recommend you never do this. Do not answer the question by simply saying, well, I would probably use React and Redux and Node and Express. That's not what your interviewer wants to hear. Anyone can pick out a list of different technologies. What they're trying to get out of you when they ask this question is why you would pick a particular technology. So a much better way of answering this or addressing the different technologies would be to say something like, well, I would probably decide to use a web framework on the front end. Here are the requirements of such a framework. I would need something that could easily render out a list of tweets, and maybe it would be a framework that would have to work very well on mobile if I expected my users to access this page frequently from a mobile device. So don't just list out the technologies, list out the qualities or the attributes of a particular framework that you want to use. Do not just say, I would use React. That is not what your interviewer is looking for. Now, the next tip I recommend here is to draw stuff out. Draw out a diagram. Draw out maybe the main web application interface. In the case of Twitter, that's a great example. Or for something like Uber, draw out the mobile screen, like what a user sees when they're trying to find a ride. That will help guide the discussion and will also help make sure that you understand the product that you're trying to build. If you've never used Twitter before, well, answering a question about how would you design Twitter might be really challenging. So you could start off by drawing out a diagram of the main user interface. And if you don't really understand how Twitter is put together or how it works, that could be an opportunity for your interviewer to correct you and say, oh, just so you know, Twitter really revolves around, say, the user feed or something like that. So drawing out diagrams really helps communicate your knowledge of the actual product, and it'll help your interviewer kind of guide you if they're going to give you any guidance at all. Now, finally, this is bar none the most important thing to keep in mind about this question. Talk, communicate. This question is not about your interviewer trying to get some insight on how to build Twitter. Like, they're not sitting there taking down notes and saying, oh, this is priceless stuff. I'm going to go home and build out Twitter thanks to what this person is saying. This person is asking you this question because they want to gauge your ability to communicate complicated topics. So above all, talk and voice what you're thinking. Don't sit there and say, oh, well, I'm organizing my thoughts. Give me 30 seconds. That leads to a lot of very uncomfortable silence. As soon as as your interviewer asks you this question, respond and give an instant follow-up question. Say something like, okay, you want me to do Twitter. Well, is there a particular area that you want me to focus on? Instantly respond back to them and start talking and try to get some more insights to what is going on, or at least give them some idea of what you are thinking. Okay, so that's my high-level notes. Now we're going to pivot a little bit, and I'm going to give you one possible strategy that you can use to answer any type of question like this. Any type of question like, how would you design Twitter or eBay or Facebook or whatever it might be. All right, so here's the general strategy. So this is a strategy that I recommend. It might work. It might not always be exactly what your interviewer is looking for, but it's definitely a place to start. So the first thing that I do with this question, because I have personally been asked this question many times, I usually start off by identifying 2 or 3 core features in the product. So to do this first thing right here, this is where drawing out a diagram of the core user interface is really helpful. So if I was asked, how would you build Twitter? I would probably build out or draw out a very quick sketch like this on the whiteboard. So you don't have to be this detailed, but at least, for the purposes of this lecture and this course, I decided to put a lot of detail in here. But I would at least probably put on some boxes and say, here are where some trending tweets go. Here's where the user feed is. Here is a list of suggestions on who to follow. And then there's a moments feature, there's notifications, there's messages, and of course, my ability to tweet. So I would probably look at this diagram right here, and I would say, I want to pick out 2 core features of this product to focus on. And so for me, I might say, I want to focus on exactly how tweeting works. Like, how does a tweet work? How does a user create a tweet? What happens when they create a tweet? And then I might also decide to focus on the user feed and start to think about how that user feed is put together. And so I would identify these 2 core features and start to think about possible ways of implementing them. So that would be everything from the web interface. So when a user clicks on that tweet button, what should really happen? And then also think about what happens when we send a request to the backend server to create a new tweet. Again, this is where we start to think about some of the database implementation. So maybe we have to think about exactly what fields a tweet in the database has. This very quickly leads into your ability to identify and address different difficulties around those 2 features. So in the case of, let's say, writing a tweet and also showing a user feed or a feed of different tweets that are very popular, I would start to very quickly think about some of the big challenges around implementing both of those features. So in the case of tweeting, I would think to myself, what does a tweet look like in the database? I would think about, how do we make the hashtag topic system work and the mention system work? What would be some possible implementations around those? And then finally, I might think about, how would we implement retweets? On the case of putting together a feed, I would start to ask myself, what's the biggest challenge there? Well, the biggest challenge is probably deciding what tweets to show to a user. Like, what are the most interesting or the most popular tweets that we want to surface to a user when they first log into the product? So again, this is really just going through the process of trying to identify and address big challenges around building a particular feature. Remember, that is the real goal of this question. Your interviewer wants to see your ability to figure out and address different challenges before you are actually implementing the product. That's what this question is all about. Again, it is testing your experience with building software. Now, the very last thing here, and this is usually where all of these design questions lead to inevitably, no matter how well you ask or answer these first three items right here, inevitably your interviewer is probably going to say, okay, that sounds good. Now let's think about how this product would work or how those two features would work once we start getting hundreds of thousands or millions of users. And so that inevitably is the question about scaling out your product. So for this is an area where it would be really unfair for your interviewer to expect you to give a very concrete answer of, oh, well, I would do this, this, and this, and here are absolute concrete step-by-step ways that I would scale out the product. Instead, I really recommend you start thinking about some general strategies for how you would scale out products in general. And so two possible ways of addressing scaling for additional users would be to mention something about caching data or caching requests from the database or data from the database, and then also think about some general ways in which we can address the overall server architecture to make sure that we could scale it out for additional users. So this is one area that I want to give you just a little bit more detail on than some of the other areas that we've been talking about. So I first want to talk about caching a little bit. Again, caching is something that can be applied to just about every single product out there. So if you've never worked with caching before, I really recommend maybe reading a quick blog post or two about how you would cache data in general. So the general idea here is that maybe a user comes to our server and they say, hey, I want to get my tweet feed, like give me my feed of top tweets. Let's imagine for a second that feed is very computationally expensive to put together. Like it takes a full second to decide what tweets to show to the user. And so if we are starting to get millions of different users who are accessing our server at the same time, building out that feed of tweets for every single request that comes in could get really expensive really quickly. So one possible way of addressing that is to say that for some particular user, like user ABC, when they first come to our server, maybe we will get a list of tweets out of our database, and we will run some really expensive algorithm on the server to calculate this user's feed, like calculate the top 10 tweets that we want to show this user. And then we could send those 10 tweets back to the user, and then simultaneously also take that top 10 list of tweets and store it in some memory store, like Memcache or Redis or whatever it might be. Then anytime that this same user comes back, like let's say in the next 5 minutes or something, rather than going back to the database and pulling out our base list of tweets again and running that expensive algorithm again, maybe we just go right back to that memory store, pull out the previous feed that we had just calculated, and send it back to the user. And so this is the idea of caching, doing some expensive work one time, storing the result, and then reusing that result as soon as we need to recalculate it again. Again, the idea of caching can be used in just about every single one of these design questions. So I really recommend you brush up on caching a little bit for the purposes of answering this. Now, the other easy way to answer the scaling question is to talk about deployment options or deployment architecture. And so this is another area where it usually comes down to one very solid concrete answer. We could say that for a given user, maybe we are not able to satisfy a million different users with a single machine running our server. So an easy way to approach this would be to say that we are going to create a load balancer. Whenever a user makes a request to our application, it will go to this load balancer, and then the load balancer will randomly assign that request to any one of a number of different identical servers. And so we could have many different servers that are completely invisible to the user, and any one of those servers can handle a given request and respond back. And so this would be an example of horizontal scaling for our application. This is another area where it's really easy to just memorize this general idea of a load balancer, and then it's applicable to just about every single one of these design questions out there. Okay, so that is a high-level overview of the classic how to design Twitter question. Again, the big things to keep in mind here are that the question is trying to assess your experience with building products. The interviewer wants to hear your experience and how you address a problem, and it's not quite so important that you nail the actual implementation. They are much more interested in seeing what you spend time on and what you start to think about as soon as you are asked this question. So as soon as possible, you want to start identifying different problems, because that is showing your ability as an engineer to think ahead and anticipate problems before they come up, which is obviously really important in a job environment. All right, so I think that's a long enough lecture on this. Let's take a break here and continue in the next video.